Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you, friends of faith and freedom. Ralph gave my whole speech. Are there any questions? What a treat to be here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for coming from around the state, around the country, to come here for this important conference. And Ralph, you've done a great job, once again, being a leader in the conservative cause now for 2 decades and bringing some of the best luminaries in the conservative cause, fiscal and social conservatives, together. Karl Rove, Newt Gingrich, Grover Norquist, Gary Bauer. Excellent work, and I wish I could stay for more of the conference, but just great work. Great to see you and Joanne again, and I really appreciate your long-standing leadership for these principles that have made our state and our nation great, and honored to be here. And thanks for all of you for coming. There's important things going on in our country. Have you noticed? And I'm glad you're here in the nation's capital to be able to learn from some of the best people around, to discuss the issues that are important, that are on your heart, that are important to your community, your state, and your nation, so that you can go back more informed, more motivated to make a difference in a critical time in our country. You know, in Virginia, our flagship statement is Virginia is for lovers. We're changing that to Virginia is for lovers of elections, because we always have one, and they're always the most important election of our lifetime, and I think one certainly could say that's the case here. Don't you think it's a great time to be a conservative in America today? Well, I just want to say thanks to the support of so many people in this room and so many conservative Virginians. I was fortunate to do something I never thought as a kid I'd do, and that is to grow up and follow in the footsteps of Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, the first 2 governors of Virginia, and be privileged to be just an average middle-class kid from Fairfax County that got to be the 71st governor of Virginia. It's an amazing thing. In America, you work hard, you try to play by the rules, you try to be honest, you follow the traditions that made this nation great, and you can still be anything you want to be in this country. Don't you believe it? That's the kind of country that we've got. And the same is true of the help that so many of you gave to my friend Chris Christie in New Jersey. He's a good, strong conservative, former prosecutor, a guy with strong convictions. He's governing the way he campaigned, cleaning up corruption, cutting spending, fighting special interests, and he has just done a marvelous job as well. And Chris and I were honored to be sort of the tip of the spear of the conservative renaissance by helping to blaze a few trails last year with immense help. Some of you have already told me today, you know, I sent people from Ohio or Maryland to your state to help you. Stories that I still hadn't heard. Those good stories of support from around the country are still coming in. So thank God for friends, and thank you for what you did for so many conservatives over this the last decades, but particularly this last year as you helped me and others to get to the point that we're at now. You remember what happened the last time 2 conservative governors won from New Jersey and Virginia. It was 1993. And the next year, Newt Gingrich, the contract with America, conservatives saying what they believed in, landslide in 94, and it changed America for a decade. I'm certainly hoping that'll happen again this year with your hard work. Are you ready for that kind of renaissance? Well, I want to tell you some things you already know, and that is we have some immense challenges in this country right now. And I know we discuss those things that are ever on people's hearts and minds and look at the status of the country in every election. But we're at a point right now where we are vastly becoming a debtor nation. $13.23 trillion in debt. Spending that is out of control, new spending packages, it seems like every couple months from this Congress. By the way, that debt is $46,000 per American. I hope you don't feel any worse when you leave here, but your credit card bill went up dramatically. That's what we're giving to our kids and our grandkids. Great to see some young people here, by the way. But that's the kind of government we're running right now, growing at $1.6 trillion per year. It is immoral, it is unsustainable, and if we don't change it, we will no longer be a nation of great prosperity because we simply will not be able to afford to pay our bills. So cutting government spending, getting our fiscal house in order, making sure that we keep that formula and recipe of American entrepreneurship and success alive by keeping taxes, regulation, and litigation low. That's what we're going to need to turn things around. Spending is addictive. Remember Ronald Reagan's statement about spending? He said, government spending is like a baby's alimentary canal. It has an insatiable appetite at one end and no responsibility at the other. Okay, if you're not laughing, ask your neighbors what an alimentary canal is and you'll get the picture. But the point is, once you start spending on a government program, it's got more lives than a cat. It just, things just don't go away without a lot of strong leadership. We've got this one-size-fits-all, big government, womb to tomb, Washington knows best approach in this Congress. That is, I believe, trampling on the 10th Amendment. It's why you see states like Virginia standing up for the 10th Amendment by suing the federal government in federal court over this health care mandate upon our state. Because that issue is really not about health care. It's about what did our founders mean about federalism. And if I, as a member of Congress, can combine with my other members of Congress to say, you, every one of you Americans, must buy a good or a service, and if you don't, we will fine you, then there really are no limits left to federal power. And the Congress is really left to do anything. And so it is not health, it is about what our founders meant. That 10th Amendment was what part of the amendment package that sealed the deal back in 1789 that got us from an Articles of Confederation that weren't working for 11 years to a constitutional republic with a constitution and the Bill of Rights. The first 8 were to protect you, your individual liberties, and the last 2 were critically important to say whatever the federal government isn't authorized to do in Article 1, Section 8, everything else is left to the people corporately and the states. You forget about that 10th Amendment, the forgotten amendment, and you basically undermine the compact that great Virginians like Mr. Mason and Mr. Madison, pledged their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor to construct. So it is an important issue, and it is one that is being talked about over these next 54 days and 3 hours until the polls close. That is a critical issue for America today. So those are some of the things that I think are at stake. I think that it is important to have that discussion. Mr. Jefferson said that government closest to the people governs best and also governs least. And that's why he believed that the local governments and the states, the laboratories of democracy, as he called it, were the place where the good ideas would largely resonate. And that's why the limits of federal power were so important. And these are the discussions now that I think are going to affect this election and begin to usher in the end of this era of big government, where the free enterprise system is being trampled by Congress, where Congress is taking over a lion's share of GM, taking over the student loan system, regulating Wall Street like never before, and on and on and on, putting significant new unfunded federal mandates on the state. The health care bill alone, besides the legal issues that I raised, will mean $1.7 billion of new unfunded mandates on the state of Virginia by the year 2022. Many governors, Republican and Democrat, are concerned by the mandates that are in this and other bills to tell the states you must do this, and good luck paying for it when we're in the worst fiscal crisis in modern history. The bills just cannot be paid with this. So I think, given those challenges, it's not hard to see why there's the beginning of a conservative renaissance in this country. And I think that is a very good and a very healthy thing. But I'd say to you that it's not just about victories. It's not about which party has control. It's not about who gets the perks of power to make the appointments and so forth. It's about what kind of ideas that we have that govern America after 234 years of the American experiment, and what is our country going to look like in 5 or 10 years, and what kind of country do we leave our kids? And it's about getting results. I think one of the things that Chris and I talked about a lot was not just the rhetoric that you hear that often separates different sides of the ideological spectrum, but is how do you translate those ideas into getting results. Because I think most Americans at the end of the day, they want government to stick to the things that it's supposed to do them well, and then leave them free to pursue the American dream using their God-given talents without excess government intervention. That's what I think most people expect. And so that's what we've tried to do in Virginia. I've got a couple of my folks with me. I've got my Secretary of Education who's traveling with me today, Gerard Robinson, who's a great reformer. Gerard was former head of the group called BAO, the Black Alliance for Education Options, did a great job in being a national leader for the charter school movement, and he's now come to Virginia and helping us to usher in a new wave of education reforms, and I'm glad Gerard is able to be here today. Here's a couple things that we've done I think that makes sense that we're trying to make sure is set some example for why conservative principles work. You obviously know that. That's why you're here. But when and Ralph told you just a little bit about this, when I came into office 7 months ago, I had two deficits. One was for the current budget ending in fiscal 2010 with a deficit about $1.8 billion, and we decided that was just unacceptable. And so what we decided to do was to quickly cut back spending. We had a hiring freeze put in place. We created incentives for our state employees to save money at the end of the budget year and not spend it. You know how that works in federal government and state government. And as a result of that, we ended up the fiscal year with a $400 million budget surplus. So it's a small amount, but we're going to now be able to put that now into capital infrastructure and some other programs that are one-time, non-recurring expenditures that won't be built into our base operating budget. We also came in with a $4.2 billion budget deficit for the next fiscal year 11 and 12. And my predecessor introduced a budget with $2 billion in cuts and $2 billion in tax increases, the largest tax increase in Virginia history, because the one he supported 5 years ago that was only $1.5 billion in tax increases wasn't big enough. So I made it pretty clear that we're not raising taxes. We're going to set priorities. We're going to make tough decisions, because guess what? Businesses are doing it. Families are doing it. Everybody that graduates from kindergarten knows you can't spend what you don't have. So let's make fiscal conservative budgeting the way we do things in Virginia. And I'm really delighted. Republicans and Democrats, after a little bit of discussion, understood that. They realized it. They were not willing to go forward with a $2 billion tax increase, and we made some very tough choices, and there'll be some short-term pain in Virginia until we grow our way out of it. But we were able to balance the budget. I think one of the first states to do it in the post-stimulus environment going into 2012, and we now have a balanced budget for the next couple of years. What a novel idea. That's why I'm so proud of Congressman Goodlatte that's introduced a balanced budget amendment in the U.S. Congress. So we also try to do some things that honor the principle that every young person ought to be able to have access to a good education, and that money's not the be-all and the end-all. It doesn't matter what kind of family you come from. It doesn't matter what your zip code is. We ought to be able to provide the options for a good education and some reasonable choices for our citizens. And so with Secretary Robinson's help, we got a new charter school bill passed to allow us to make it a lot easier to have charter schools. We started a college laboratory school program to create another choice with innovative approaches between our K-12 and in our higher education system. We started a virtual school program to allow the power of the internet to be used for flexible, low-cost options so young people can learn from the best and brightest minds around the state and around the country through virtual schools. And even though we had a few fights with some folks that wanted to protect the status quo that is failing some kids in some of the communities in Virginia, we were able to get all those things passed. And we focused on thank you. We focus primarily on economic development. It is, after all, the free enterprise system that has made America great. How many of you remember that famous document written on April 10, 1606? Shame on you. How many Virginians are here? Okay. Well, of course you remember it's the Virginia Company Charter written by King James. Same one, by the way, that commissioned the King James Bible 5 years later, just for you historians out there. But he wrote this document that he chartered the 8 noblemen and the other 136 men and boys that got on those 3 ships in December of 1606, setting out for the New World that became America. They landed, not at Jamestown, but Virginia Beach, those of you that really know your history, to plant a cross and say, we claim this land for Christ, and this will be a new kind of nation. And then they went on to land at Jamestown, and they opened that document, and guess what? It was a document that obviously talked about faith and values, but first and foremost, it talked about free enterprise. It talked about taking risks and bringing back new treasures to the New World, and what the social contract would be between the king and the noblemen and those 144 brave people that decided to come on here. The point is, this country was born out of this idea of free enterprise and entrepreneurship and hard work and sharing in the fruits of your labor. That's the traditions not only of Virginia but of this nation. And that's why we've been promoting so much in Virginia, keeping government out of interfering with the free enterprise system as much as possible. It's why we focused on the fact that if you're going to grow your way out of an economic downturn, the worst thing to do is what the Congress is doing and put more taxes and regulation and micromanagement into the free enterprise system. You try to unleash the genius of the free enterprise system. You try to create more jobs because it's the job that allows people access to the American dream. It's the job that gives a person their sense of dignity and worth every day. It's the job that allows people not to depend on government and not to allow the government to have to spend more on welfare and social services and health care and prisons. But allows people to take care of themselves in a system of responsibility and accountability. And so these are some of the conservative principles of government that we've tried to put in place. And as a result of that, we've been fortunate this year to be ranked the most business-friendly state in the country by the Polina Corporation. Now, we were only second in America, ranked by CNBC a couple months ago. And the only reason we're second is because Texas was first, and I told Rick Perry we'd slack on him a little bit because he's running for re-election. But we're coming back next year to be number 1 in that poll in Virginia. And the idea, of course, is free markets work. Values matter too, and character counts. And people of faith have been the ones that have built this nation, and we have a marvelous pluralistic system where people are free to worship any way they choose. That was impressed upon me heavily when I first went into the House of Delegates in 1992. I sat in the corner of the House, which is where they always put the freshmen, over in the corner. And there's only one plaque in the entire House of Delegates in Virginia, and it happened to be right behind me. And it was Mr. Jefferson's Statute for Religious Freedom, one of the 3 accomplishments he was most proud of that he put on his tombstone. But it basically says, Almighty God hath created the mind free, and that it is your duty to worship your Creator, but government should not tell you how to worship. I mean, it's a central tenet. That statute, a couple years later, became the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So we have been born as a nation and a group of people of faith. Washington said it a little differently in his first inaugural address, in something that I expect that he intended to be passed down through the generations, that I think is important for our country to always remember as it relates to the influence of faith in the public square. And he said that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected to remain on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained. And I think what he meant by that, and he was our first commander-in-chief and our first president, and could have been king, but he understood the limits of power and walked away from it because he understood that he just fought against that tyranny. But he was trying to say that there are certain principles upon which a nation of liberty and laws must be based that are essentially absolute principles. And to the degree that you stay based on those moral absolutes which heaven itself has created, you'll be a great nation. And the degree that you depart from those, you will not. So we try to take that adage. We take Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Washington and Mr. Madison pretty seriously in Virginia, as you can imagine. And we've done some things over the years to really try to protect that value and the protection particularly of life and family and marriage, which are the bedrocks of our society, and passing bills like welfare reform to put more accountability back with families, to protect the integrity of the family and create responsibility within the family. Parental notification, informed consent, parental consent legislation to stand up for the value of human life. Just this year, after some 20 years of battle, I sent down an amendment in the budget this year to finally enact the federal Hyde Amendment in law in the state of Virginia so that we don't have taxpayer-funded abortions except in very few exceptions. And like most battles, they're not easy. It passed by one vote in the Virginia Senate. So votes really do matter. I also just made a decision last week that we would only accept federal funding for abstinence-based education in our public schools, and I think that's the right thing to do. So my point is out of that is, I'm not saying any of this to brag, it's because I've had a lot of help and a lot of teamwork and a lot of bipartisan cooperation to do this. You need people to work together. I've got a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. You've got to have people working together to get anything done. I'd like to see more of that happening in Washington, frankly, regardless of who's in charge. But what's important as you leave here, hopefully inspired by the many speakers you're going to hear from over the next day and what you've heard from already today, is that elections really do matter. And the kind of people, men and women, that are elected must be the kind of people that you want to hire that reflect your values and your principles in office. And therefore, you must sacrifice as well during the days and weeks and months that lead up to those elections to make sure you hire the right kind of people. Edmund Burke said, of course, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men or women to do nothing. You don't want to be caught in that place in doing nothing. When my daughter was in Iraq, when I was elected Attorney General 5 years ago, 70% of the people in Iraq turned out to vote. Do you remember the images of those women who, for the first time, got to vote because of the blood, sweat, and tears of American men and women in uniform? After 25 years of the tyranny and the horrors of the rule of Saddam Hussein, they tasted liberty, for the first time invested in their own country to be able to make a choice. And they faced snipers and IEDs on the way to the polls. 70% voted. That same year, 45% of the people in Virginia came out to vote for me, vote in the election. 45%. Sunny day, nobody shooting at them. We take democracy too much for granted here. We cannot continue this pace of disinterest, particularly among young people. We've got to take these elections as though people were shooting at us, and it really does matter. And so I encourage you to remember those kinds of examples, the sacrifices that the writers of the Declaration went through. Many of them did, in fact, pledge their lives and fortunes and their sacred honor, and many of them lost their lives and their fortunes. None of them lost their sacred honor. All but about 3 either died or were bankrupt or had something else bad happen to them because of signing that declaration. And yet, all we're called on is do a little work before an election. So, if your principles matter a lot to you, I'd say we need to get to work and do some things. I think as we look at what's ahead and what's at stake, I think it's important to remember that I think American people, and particularly independent voters, unaligned voters, really are concerned about these tremendous deficits, about spiraling debt, about lack of individual discipline, about excess government, and maybe a vacuum of leadership in the things that are really important. I really do think that they are interested in conservative principles of duty and self-reliance and responsibility and reining in the spending that will destroy our fiscal integrity going forward. I remember being a young dad in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was first elected and thinking, boy, that's a pivotal time for our country. Well, this is also a very pivotal time for our country. I think it is the beginning of a conservative renaissance. So I'm just incredibly honored to have been a small part of that with Chris Christie and getting elected last year. But I think you're going to see, and you're seeing already, a strong group of conservative candidates for state houses, for gubernatorial races, for the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House, all over this country that are beginning to echo these same themes of traditional values, of fiscal responsibility, of limited government. These truly are the things that are the birthright of the nation, truly are the things that have given us the level of prosperity that we've enjoyed for 234 years as Americans. And so it is the time where you should be unashamed and unabashed to stand up for those principles in this public square. And I really think if you do that, that you will get the results that you want on Election Day. And then the challenge is to hold your officials accountable to govern like they campaigned. That is a tougher challenge for some. And so it is what is required for American democracy to stay strong. There's an old saying, if the people will lead, the politicians will follow. You probably heard that. This is your time to lead. I really do believe you've got great people of character, some really in both parties, but particularly in the Conservative Party, that are working hard to stand up for these principles, knowing that the other choices that have been made have not led us down the road to continue American exceptionalism. And that's not a good thing, neither for America nor for the world. People depend on America being strong and true and vibrant and trustworthy and steady. It is what's kept tyranny in check for the better part of the last century. And I think still, as Reagan said, is the shining city on the hill and still the best hope for mankind. So thanks so much for letting me speak for a minute. It's an honor to be the governor of Virginia. I really appreciate Ralph Reed and the Faith and Freedom Coalition for its good work in summoning conservative leaders from around the country to come here to talk to one another, encourage one another, learn from one another on what's working in your states, and then go back home and make a difference for America. God bless you. Thank you very much.